Hi there, welcome to Explain This, a podcast where we try to explain complex things in simpler ways for people of all ages. I'm your host Jin Kim, and today we're going to talk about the joys of reading and the written word. That's right, it's all about literacy and why you should give a hoot about it. Let's get started. What's the last book you've really enjoyed reading? I've finally gotten around to reading Lord of the Flies by William Golding, and was surprised how much I enjoyed it and how relevant it is to current affairs. I'm also very much enjoying Terry Pratchett's Guards, and Not the End of the World by Hannah Ritchie. But today's episode isn't a surprise book club, don't worry. It's about literacy. I can enjoy these delightful reads because, well, I can read, which is something you take for granted. Before the modern era, only 3 or 4 out of 10 people, at most, could read written text. Even now, 2 decades into the 21st century, about 87% of the global population are considered literate, or able to read and write. Which is awesome progress, but it does mean that 1 billion people on this earth aren't able to enjoy a good read, whether it's a magical fiction or really useful instructions on how to do something important. And even worse, you might be hearing murmurs on the news or from teachers and parents that we're seeing a fall in literacy rates in many developed countries. What's that about? Is TikTok literally rotting our children's brains to the point that they can't even read the alphabet? Well, sort of, and not really. Because it turns out, literacy is a much more complex concept than just whether you can read or write. Which is why we're going to start off by explaining literacy to you as if you're a child. What if I told you that you had a superpower? With this superpower, you can fly, move giant boulders just by moving one finger, make people laugh and cry, or even create entire worlds. That's right, the greatest superpower in nature? Literacy. The ability to read and write. Now, don't roll your eyes like I'm another adult telling you to get off your iPad and read a book, even though you should totally do that. I'm going to tell you why it's important that you can use this superpower. You see, thousands of years ago, most people couldn't read or write. This meant that if they wanted to tell someone something, they had to do it in person, or get another person to pass it on. No WhatsApp or email or even snail mail. Even worse, it meant that there was no way to pass on useful information. Like, say you figured out the best bread recipe. You couldn't just share it on Instagram like people do now. You had to teach people and show it to them in person. But with writing, we suddenly had the power to spread knowledge and stories and information, not just to anywhere, but any when. We can still laugh at a complaint letter from 3,700 years ago, where someone wrote back to the store saying they were super unhappy with the quality of carpet that they bought. Thanks to writing, anyone can learn how to make a delicious cake, how to build a house, or learn a new language to read even more books full of tasty knowledge. Even better, thanks to writing, we've been able to gradually evolve both the sciences and literature, to the point that we have epic stories like Lord of the Rings, to understanding gravity enough to take to the skies in airplanes and send people to the moon. All because we don't have to reinvent the wheel each time, because someone wrote down how to make a wheel already. But writing is only one side of the coin. There's no point having a tool that people can't use. Even though we've had writing for over 5,000 years, the majority of people throughout history, especially the average Joe blog and Joan blog like you and me, couldn't read it. To these people, all writing would look like a string of squiggly words or pictures. Maybe it looks like that to you as well, depending on how good you're at reading. Think about what all of these people miss out on. The greatest superpower humanity has, and they can't even use it. They wouldn't be able to learn new things unless they learned it in person. They wouldn't be able to read the news, so they wouldn't know what's happening in the world unless someone's yelling that the English are coming, or a friend personally tells you about a party that's happening on the weekend, instead of, reading the newspaper or what the invitation card says. Most importantly, it means that people who can read and write hold all the power, because they can keep records like who bought how many apples, who sold how many oranges, who lives where, and what happened 100 years ago, and so on. So if you can't read, then you're not going to join the cool kids club where you can earn more money and live healthier, better lives. Reading gives you knowledge, and knowledge is power. All in all, reading is awesome. Not being able to read closes a lot of doors. And it's especially the case now, where writing is such an important part of modern life, that people who can't read or write are less likely to get jobs, more likely to go to prison, and likely to die earlier, or at least live in much poorer health. Nowadays, many more people know how to read, but many people still can't read well. Like, you can read out loud what the letters and words say, but you might not be able to understand it. Like a parrot who is able to repeat back what you've said, but they don't know what you're talking about. This is a real problem because even though people have the superpower of literacy, they're not able to use it properly, and then they fall behind the people who can use the superpower. And that seems unfair. So, instead of watching another episode of Cocomelon or Paw Patrol or whatever you're into right now, pick up a Harry McClary or Thomas the Tank Engine or The Story of the Little Mole Who Knew It Was None of His Business, a lovely German book where a mole is looking for someone who pooped on his head. Because reading is fun. Reading's awesome. But most importantly, reading will make you a literal superhero. Welcome back. Chances are, if you're an avid listener of this podcast, you probably do know how to read and write. But how well can you read and write? How literate are you? That's the question we're going to hopefully answer today while convincing you why you should even care about literacy. In the simplest sense of the word, literacy literally means the ability to understand literature. As in, you know how to write things down and how to read things that are written. You'd think, yeah, either you can read and write or you can't. How are you going to make an entire episode in this? But you'd be surprised. Because it turns out, literacy is actually really complicated and complex. Ask any English teacher how they would define literacy. You'll probably get that depends. How much time do you have? Lucky for me, you've given me your undivided attention for the next 45 minutes to go over these various definitions and complexities. Woo! If we were living in ancient times, like in the city of Babylon, the question of what is literacy would have been simple. Can you read and write? Mainly because it wasn't a common skill. The majority of people couldn't read or write. To be technical, we call this alphabetical literacy, as in, can you understand and use the alphabet? But nowadays, we've made remarkable progress in the history of education, and we've managed to get the global alphabetical literacy rate up to about 86%, as in 6 out of 7 people know how to read and write in their mother language. Which is an important side note, because much to the disbelief of many ignorant Pakeha tourists traveling in non-English speaking countries, English is not the default language in every country you go to. I know, shocker, right? Anyway, a bulk of the 14% who can't read or write come from less well-off or resourced nations such as many African nations, as well as people who live in poverty or are too young, like under the age of 24 months. In adults and teenagers of developed countries, the literacy rate is far higher than this, usually well above 90%. Like in the great United States of America, where a whopping 79% of adults who were literate as of 2024. Yeah, that is below the global average. Well done, America. But seriously, we usually see adult literacy rates of 99% in places like Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Korea, Japan, etc. Which means the question of can you read or write is not as useful of a marker anymore. What does matter is something called functional literacy. As in, yes, you can read a list of instructions ad verbatim, or word for word, but do you actually understand what that text says? Can you write a functional piece of literature, whether that's a creative story, an essay that explains your point, or even a simple email? Because turns out, many adults who believe that they're illiterate aren't functionally literate. This can range from people who aren't able to critically analyze the multi-layered text that they're reading, such as not understanding satire or men who miss the point of Fight Club and think it's glorifying Tyler Durden, instead of the direct opposite meaning, to people who aren't able to write or sequence words in a functional manner. These people, if you gave them an instruction of how to nail a picture to the wall, might not be able to follow those instructions because they can read the words, but they don't understand how to use them appropriately. You know, kind of like Derek Zoolander naming his education facility Derek Zoolander Center for Kids Who Can't Read Good and Who Want to Learn to Do Other Stuff Good Too. Oh, the irony of that scene is just... Functional literacy is much harder to define than alphabetical literacy, which we also call traditional literacy. UNESCO defines it as the ability to identify, understand, interpret, create, communicate, and compute using printed and written materials associated with varying contexts. Which is a long way to say It's not enough to just read what's written, but you actually need to understand what it means and be able to manipulate that information in your brain so you derive useful information for it, while also knowing how to communicate effectively with other people in a variety of social and cultural contexts. A good example of being traditionally literate but functionally illiterate, as in not literate, would be Ed from the cult classic 1997 movie Good Burger, who reads a legal contract, says,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. I know some of these words.
and signs it, while not understanding that the contract means that his co-worker Dexter will take 80% of the bonus that Ed is supposed to receive for his delicious Ed sauce. If Ed was functionally literate, he'd read the contract, pick up the fact that this is a hugely exploitative and unfair contract, and refuse to sign. So, as you can see, literacy is not as black and white as you can read or not. It's more about how well and how functionally you can read and write. We're going to talk about exactly why literacy is important, both in the traditional and functional sense. But for that, we need to go all the way back to 5,000 years ago, when writing was first invented. Writing is old, like as old as the duration of recorded history, obviously. The funny thing is, we think writing was actually invented 5 different times by humanity. I think that's pretty cool, because it implies that writing is so important that it came about organically in 5 different places, without any influence from others. It's a bit hard to pin down exactly when writing was invented, because without a TARDIS, we can't tell when the first instance someone wrote something down is. We've had drawings and other forms of inscriptions of symbols throughout prehistory, but the first examples of writing seem to all lie around 3500 to 3000 BCE, as in more than 5000 years ago. The cuneiform script of the Sumerian language of Mesopotamia is typically considered the first written language, but we also see examples of ancient writing in Egypt, China, Mesoamerica, and the Indus civilization. Writing probably came about because people figured out it would be useful for 2 reasons. The first is that writing allows you to send messages throughout space, as in, if you have a tablet with the king's decree written on it, you can send specific orders to a faraway land without worrying that you're getting a he says, she says type of distortion of the message. The second is that it allows you to send messages through time, as in, if you write down important facts such as the royal family tree or accounting details or important historical events of the nation, then as long as the thing that you wrote on survives, the message survives and future generations can read it. Although my favorite quote-unquote reason for writing is the first known story of the invention of writing. There's a Sumerian epic poem that describes the Lord of Kulaba patting some clay and writing words on it like a tablet because, quote, the messenger's mouth was heavy and he couldn't repeat the message. I love the thought that writing came out of the need for ease and maybe even laziness. Because if you can write down the message and get people to read it, messengers don't have to tiresomely repeat it over and over and waste their voice, right? Anyway, we can summarize the use of ancient writing largely to 3 broad categories: politics, economics, and religion. Like most good things throughout history, when a new technology is invented, people in power ask the question, how can we use this technology to get more powerful and stay in power for longer? Consider technologies such as explosives like gunpowder and nuclear fission, communication tools like the internet and radio, and yes, even writing. Even in ancient times, people understood that the ability to write and read was going to be a superpower, that when yielded effectively, would let a group of people dominate those around them. So reading and writing was strictly controlled with the invention of the scribe profession, a highly prestigious and elite group of people who were responsible for writing important stuff down. Scribes held so much power and prestige because they were the ones that had the power to write down things like the law, the leader's decrees, and all official documents. It meant that the common people had to rely on what the scribes wrote and for them to read the messages to know the important news and how their society functioned. It also meant that the higher-ups had to trust the scribes to record information accurately to avoid misuse of power. Like, imagine if the scribe wrote down that the king made all of these unfair laws when it wasn't the case. People would be angry at the king, not suspect the scribe for making stuff up. Furthermore, the use of writing and scribes meant that leaders could become more bureaucratic. You could set up elaborate ruling systems with local councils reporting to the central government, and you could micromanage even the far reaches of your realm because you could write down reports and decrees. So writing became a hugely important political tool, and it was controlled through the strict maintenance of who could be a scribe and what kind of education people received. We see this kind of political control of literacy throughout history. Think of colonial powers who tried to eradicate the indigenous people's language, such as the British Empire and Imperial Japan. We even see it with women being banned from going to school or not being taught to read, because ever since writing was invented, people understood how much power it gives people. Anyway, let's move on to the other two areas. Economics vastly benefited from the invention of writing, because now you could actually keep ledgers of trades. No longer did you have to rely on trusting your business partner how much a cow is worth or how many stacks of hay you sold them last month. Now, there was a system for permanently recording how many items were sold and bought, and for how much. This also meant that you didn't just have to rely on case-by-case barter. You could actually have a finance system with currency and loans and banking. Unfortunately, we see again how this gave people who were literate more power, because royalty and governments were now able to accrue even more wealth through the clever use of accounting and taxes. And speaking of writing granting power, we can't forget our third friend, religion. Whether you're religious or not, we can't deny that religion has been an integral part of society since ancient times. But writing changed the game, letting religion spread further and deeper than ever before. If you look at the major religions with a large global following, you note an interesting commonality. They all have a form of a holy text. This might be religious coda such as the Bible or the Quran, or recordings of teachings and lessons such as those of Buddha and Confucius. But even more interesting is that in all of these major religions, the religious leader who founded the religion didn't necessarily write down their own messages. Think about it. The New Testament was not written down by Jesus himself. It's written by the apostles. The Quran wasn't written down by Muhammad himself, and all Buddhist texts start with a Pali phrase, Evam Mesutam, which translates to, "Thus have I heard," as in, after Buddha's death and achieving nirvana, his disciples gathered and wrote down what they remembered Buddha teaching them, making sure to start with the fact that these are not their words, but their holy teacher's words. All in all, this shows the raw power of writing and who does the writing. If someone came up to you and said, God appeared in their dreams and told them you should totally worship them, they kinda sound mad. But if a bushy-bearded man comes down from the mountains with stone tablets with the 10 Commandments, saying they were the words of God immortalized in stone, he seems a little bit more credible. So, not only do the people who know how to write have more religious power and authority, but they now have the technology to spread their religion beyond their local area. Instead of going on a tour to preach the religion by spoken word, you can just write down the stories and teachings on tablets or parchment or a book, copy it a bunch, and ship it off with missionaries to distant lands, and boom, you can wallow and convert people to your faith even if they live halfway across the world from you. Heck, it's no surprise that the first major book to be mass printed by Gutenberg's movable type was the frickin' Bible, which to this day is the most widely printed book in history. So yeah, whether it's political uses, economical uses, or religious uses, those who knew how to read and write held a lot of power right from the start. Thankfully, some of these benefits of writing and reading did trickle down to the masses over time. Although literacy rates, as in traditional literacy, whether or not you could even read what letters said, never rose beyond 30 or 40% until modern times, they did go up over time. Contrary to popular belief, there were even places in antiquity, such as classical Athens and the Islamic Caliphate, where literacy was pretty widespread. Writing also helped literature develop, in the form of epic poems such as Homer's Odyssey and the Epics of Gilgamesh. It helped people write down important philosophical thoughts such as Plato's Republic, and science and technology because people could write down and share their theories, discoveries, and inventions. Technological advancements such as paper, the printing press, gas and electrical lighting, all helped writing and reading become more and more accessible to the general population, barring man-made limits such as not letting women learn to read because the patriarchy feared that it would make it harder for women to be controlled and oppressed. There's a hilariously depressing record of there being fears in 18th century Europe, as in only 300 years ago, that reading alone in bed was dangerous and immoral because, lamps might cause fires and whatnot, and if women could read, they'd shirk obligations to family and community and have immoral fantasies. So, yeah, the history of literacy smattered with themes of power and control and oppression. At the same time, there are some delightful stories, such as the awesome King Sejong the Great of the Joseon dynasty of Korea, who was such a nerd that he nearly went blind reading so much as a teenager. He took pity that literacy was being used only by the elites to maintain power, so he decided to frickin' write his own written language so that the Korean people had an easy-to-learn, practical writing system that actually fit the Korean language well, unlike the Chinese characters that were being used for writing up until then. And that's how, despite the opposition of the elites, the Korean alphabet Hangul was released in 1443, drastically boosting literacy rates throughout the Korean peninsula, improving the quality of life for the common people. Hooray! And that brings us nicely to why literacy is important. But first, let's take a short break. Welcome back. Alright, the moment you've been waiting for. We've covered what literacy is, both in the traditional sense, as in whether you can read or write at all, and the functional sense, as in you can read and write in a meaningful way to let you communicate and interact in social and cultural contexts. We've also covered the history of literacy, where we found that for 5 millennia, those who knew how to read and write had control over political power, economics and money, and religion. 3 of the most powerful forces guiding a society's rise and fall. We can look at the importance of literacy from 2 different lenses. The macro lens, as in how does literacy shape a society or community or country, and the micro lens, as in how does it affect us as individual human beings. From a macro lens perspective, literacy is a great proxy for measuring the value of human capital in the society. As we'll talk about below, literate people are more likely to become better educated, they're easier to train in skills, find better job opportunities, have better health outcomes, and in general, have a higher quality of life. So, from a societal perspective, this means that you have healthier, more efficient, and more productive workers, progressing the society in both technology and culture. It's no surprise that the widespread availability of books and paper and better lighting from the Middle Ages onwards is correlated to rapid scientific and technological advancements, as well as cultural and philosophical paradigm shifts like the Enlightenment. When people can read and write, it improves their ability to think for themselves. What's better, there's some evidence to suggest that literacy literally changes the way we think. Walter J. Ong wrote many books on language, and in his book Orality and Literacy, he makes an interesting argument that if you compare cultures based on writing versus cultures that rely on their oral tradition, the cultures that use writing show more examples of logical reasoning, as well as complex analytical and abstract thinking. Basically, if you can't write things down, you have to remember important information in the form of stories and mnemonic devices, like how Homeric epics such as the Iliad have a lot of chunked, repetitious descriptors, so that storytellers could remember and recite everything in detail. Or think of it this way. You might be pretty good at maths and write out a whole A4 page of working to solve a complicated differential equation. But if I asked you to do the same thing just in your head, or by talking through it, it's much harder. Whereas with writing, you don't have to start from scratch each time. You can write down thoughts and ideas and facts, use it as reference material, and build upon it. Isaac Newton famously stated that if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. Terry Pratchett compared J.R.R. Tolkien's work to a giant mountain like Mount Fuji. All subsequent fantasy essentially has it in their backdrop, or they're standing on it. Writing has let us build upon great works of our predecessors, so we can advance forwards and make great leaps, whether it be landing science rovers on Mars or creating worlds such as those in Dungeons and Dragons. So yeah, literacy is really important for us to live in a good society. It really is a superpower. Next, let's focus more on the microlens. How helpful is literacy to an individual? We just talked about how in pre-modern times, more than half of the world couldn't read or write. So surely it's not a necessity, like food or water or shelter, right? Like people still lived their lives and the wheel of time rolled on? But perhaps you forget that we live in a very rare time of peace and prosperity. In the grand scheme of history, if you live in a developed country and are above the poverty line, you probably are far richer, healthier, and in general, more alive than the average person in any other period of history. Yeah, if anyone ever offers you a magic time machine ability to live in any other time period, don't choose the past. And we can thank literacy for our prosperous modern times. Think about it. If you don't know how to read at all, as in you're traditionally illiterate, you're already at a huge disadvantage because our society is built on written language. Everything from road signs to bills to entertainment to education all involve some level of writing and reading. Sure, you can get by asking people questions directly, but it makes life a lot more difficult. The easiest way to understand how it feels to be illiterate in today's society is when you're traveling overseas, especially in a country where you don't speak the language. Say you're traveling alone in rural Japan without a smartphone or the ability to read Japanese. How difficult is it going to be for you to get to your next location if you can't read the bus stop signs? How will you know what to order on the menu? I recently finished reading a really weird book by Murakami Haruki called Kafka on the Shore, and there was a great description of how difficult it is for an illiterate man to travel from one Japanese city to another, and how he has to rely on the kindness of strangers to do it. Nakata is 4 times the age of the other protagonist, the 15-year-old Kafka, but he has a significantly harder time reaching his destination compared to Kafka, who can just use literacy to plan his own bus route to his destination. Anyway, you can see how, even from a practicality perspective, being able to read is hugely useful and saves you a lot of time and money potentially. But literacy does so much more for you than just making your life easier, or more interesting through novels and poetry and other delightful literature. Literacy gives you the ability to communicate more effectively in society. For example, you can participate in your community better if you can read the local newspaper or notices. You can write letters and emails to your council for suggestions or complaints. It also lets you participate in employment better. Not just because you can read job applications, write better CVs and cover letters, but because literate people are more likely to be hired. It's an established fact that literate people are easier to train in any profession because you can read warnings and instructions that are written down. You probably have more education in general, and because you can learn complex concepts easier. Being able to read lets you learn on your own. Even if you're poor, if you have access to books or the internet, then you have a means to educate yourself and learn skills and knowledge to empower yourself. In fact, literacy is one of the only ways to escape the social class that you're born into, and give yourself a chance at more wealth and quality of life. Speaking of quality of life, literacy lets you live a healthier and longer life as well. An important concept when learning about literacy is that there are many different types of literacy. We've already talked about how functional literacy is different from alphabetical or traditional literacy. We've also mentioned that you can be literate in various languages, like I'm literate in Korean and English and have limited literacy in Mandarin, Japanese, and Italian, because I've studied the language to read and write basic phrases. But I'm not literate in languages like Spanish or Hindi. Similar to this, you can be literate in English, but not literate in specific uses of English. For example, you might have perfect mastery of the English language, but not know how computers and digital media work or function. This means that you may be computer illiterate. You might be like many young people who never got taught how to save and invest money, how compound interest and loans work, or how to set up emergency funds. In this case, you might say that your financial literacy is suffering. You can also be illiterate in media. This is particularly relevant in today's climate where fake news and misinformation flood our feeds, and you have to know how to filter out what's true and evidence-based instead of unfounded rumors. You need media literacy skills, such as reading the source material and fact-checking. And then there's the fundamental beautiful language of the universe, mathematics. Numeracy, or quantitative literacy, is a type of literacy as well. You might know what the number 2 means, but if you can't do basic addition and subtraction, or how to work out how much money you're saving if something is on sale and is 20% off, then you might not have functional numeracy, and you'll end up getting ripped off a lot. Or you might be statistically illiterate and think the chances of winning a bet is 50%. You either win or you lose. That's a stats joke, sorry. Anyway, one of the most important types of literacy in my unbiased point of view as a doctor is something called health literacy. Health literacy goes deep, and I could probably do a whole episode on it by itself, but in a nutshell, it's the range of skills a person needs to look for, understand, evaluate, and use health information to make sure that their health and quality of life is advocated for. which sounds a bit hard and long to absorb, so let's use some examples. Let's say I diagnosed you with a chest infection that needs to be treated with antibiotics. If you're a nurse or doctor, I could probably tell you, you've got pneumonia, I'm prescribing you a course of Augmentin, take a TDS orally. And you'd understand that you need to swallow tablets 3 times a day and finish the whole course, because you've got good health literacy already. But if you're a non-medical person, you'd have no idea what I just said, and you might not know how to appropriately take the antibiotics. You might have questions, but you're too nervous to ask, so you might end up taking the antibiotics suboptimally and not getting properly treated. Or you might not have listened to last month's Explain This episode, not finish the whole course of antibiotics, and end up breeding a superbug. Even worse, you might accidentally overdose on it or have side effects to it and not know that it's related to the antibiotics, like vomiting and diarrhea. If you have poor health literacy, you might not understand some general health concepts that we take for granted in Western medicine. Like, you might not want to take any pain medicines because it might mask the pain and the doctors won't take me seriously, even though that's totally not how it works. You might not see your GP and ask for cancer screening programs that are relevant to your family history, or smoking cessation treatments, or even to get your blood pressure checked. All of these things might end up causing disability or death when it could have been avoided if someone had explained plainly the importance of these things to your general health. Anyway, you can imagine that if these problems affect people who are literate in the first place, how bad would it be if they weren't literate? This comes up all the time in medicine, where people experience health inequality due to illiteracy. A great example would be a doctor saying, "Oh, just read the back pain pamphlet that I put in your discharge summary. It's got everything you need to know to make the pain go away faster and for you to stay out of hospital." Not knowing that the patient can't read the pamphlet, either because they can't speak English that well, or because they can't physically read it because they never learned how to. And you have the opposite experience too. If you're literate, then you have the ability to read up health information in books and online, so you might be more aware of things to look out for, or do things that will improve your health in the long term. I had a fun experience at work just last week, where a patient was declining to have an x-ray of their swollen ankle and refusing pain relief. When this happens, it's not uncommon for doctors and nurses to think like Lady Catherine de Bourgh and go, "Obstinate, headstrong girl," and judge them, but when you ask the patient why they didn't want the test and treatment, they're able to articulate that they were worried about radiation from the x-ray and that the medicines weren't natural, and it would impact their body's natural healing. So, when I took a bit of time to explain that the radiation you receive in a limb x-ray is about the same amount of radiation you're exposed to just by living on Earth for 10 days, and significantly less than what you're exposed to on a standard overseas flight, and that bananas are actually slightly radioactive too, and that a chest x-ray is equivalent in radiation dose to 200 bananas, he was amused and reassured, consented to the x-ray, and even took some pain relief because we talked about how it actually comes from natural sources like plants. He also asked how he can look up more information on this online, so we wrote down some key search terms, which meant he could further improve his health literacy and make his next hospital visit easier and less stressful. Overall, it meant that the patient got to have a better treatment experience and outcome thanks to literacy. It's been shown study after study that literacy makes a significant difference in health outcomes in all populations, whether it's their quality of life, functional independence, or even their life expectancy. So, yeah, so far, literacy lets a person get better jobs and live healthier and longer lives. What more evidence do you need that it's important? The last important function of literacy that we need to discuss for the individual is that it empowers you. We spent the previous section talking about how the ruling elites historically restricted literacy to themselves, so that they had better control over the masses, whether it was politically, economically, or religiously. When an individual is educated and literate, they suddenly have the means to their own production and creation, because they can read the complicated legal contracts and fine prints and instruction books, and go, "Hang on, this ain't right," and start to ask important questions. It's actually easier to grasp the role literacy plays in empowerment when we look at what happens when people are illiterate. We've already discussed how illiterate people no longer have access to things we take for granted, such as accessing the health system, the legal system, managing personal finances, using digital technologies, and even navigating public transport. But what if I told you that illiteracy makes you more vulnerable to being manipulated and controlled as well? And no, this is not a conspiracy theory. That's right, the reason the ruling elites didn't want the general population to be literate historically is not just that they were afraid they'd be able to escape their social class and claim back the power, but because literacy makes it harder to manipulate and rule people. Think about it. We've mentioned that in contrast to cultures that follow the oral tradition, cultures that use written language tend to have better logical thinking and reasoning. This is because reading and writing, whether it be fiction or non-fiction, improves your ability to think critically. The more you read and write, the more your brain gets used to the development of ideas, structuring of arguments, while filling you with intellectual content from vastly varied points of views. It also improves your emotional maturity. Books allow us to live multitudes of lives. We don't have to have lived or even met a person who lived through World War I. You can read All Quiet on the Western Front and feel the terror and pointlessness of trench warfare. You can put yourselves in the shoes of an Asian immigrant trying to provide a future for their family in a society that actively discriminates against them. You can even imagine what it would be like to live in a spaceship on a suicide mission, or what it's like to live in a post-apocalyptic world where calamities try to wipe out humanity every few seasons. In general, literacy helps broaden our horizons, deepen our understanding of the world and ourselves, and to explore values that are important to us. Why do you think Nazi Germany burnt tens of thousands of books in 1933? Because they didn't want people to learn and think about liberalism and democracy and the fact that people of Jewish descent achieved all kinds of wonderful academic success. When people are illiterate, they're less likely to educate themselves and learn to question authority, challenging unethical and unjust policies, and asking uncomfortable questions like, hey, are we the baddies? One of the core components of functional literacy is the ability to critically analyze a piece of text, deduce the point that the author is trying to make, and mulling over what you can learn from this or how it impacts you. For example, a person who's traditionally literate will have no problem reading George Orwell's Animal Farm, but if they don't have functional literacy, they might only have a rudimentary grasp of what the book is trying to say. At best, they might think it's just a funny story with farm animals being all silly. It takes functional literacy, as well as historical context from reading around the subject, to understand that the book is actually an allegory of the Russian Revolution and Stalin's Communist Soviet Union. Functional literacy is also closely tied with the concept of media literacy, as in the skill of knowing how to interpret what the news and whether information on media, whether it be traditional or social media, can be trusted or not. The less literate you are, the more susceptible you are to conspiracy theories, fake news, misinformation, and disinformation. Because if you don't critically analyze text and think about it, then you'll be more likely to believe the information, just based on faulty heuristics such as, oh, this beautiful popular influencer is telling me to trust her. I should trust her. Or, man, this guy just really speaks my lingo. I should believe him. And at the end of the day, this means you're much easier to manipulate, whether it is for political reasons such as who to vote for and what dodgy policies should be allowed to pass, economic reasons such as taking your money by influencing your purchasing preferences, or even religious reasons, convincing you to commit atrocities for a holy cause such as the Crusades. So yeah, if you want to stick it to the man and not let yourself be a sheeple being controlled by the government, the best thing you can do is be functionally literate and read lots of books. So if you really want to rebel against society, stay in school, read more books, and write some provocative, well-structured essays. But as important as functional literacy is to us living a full, independent, and well life, we're unfortunately noticing the rate of functional literacy is actually falling in some countries, despite global traditional literacy rates rising. Which means, as a society, we're becoming more and more prone to the manipulation of populist politicians promising us prosperity at the cost of those who are different to us, or disinformation and conspiracy theories that make us more susceptible to illness, such as anti-vaccination campaigns causing measles to make a comeback. Joy. So why is this happening, and what will happen if it continues? On this final section, let's talk about illiteracy. So we've spent this whole episode talking about how awesome literacy is, and how humanity as a whole is becoming more and more enlightened, with a whopping 86% of the world harnessing literacy. In fact, literacy is such an important, useful, and integral skill in society, it's now considered a human right. And yet, in countries such as my home country of Aotearoa, New Zealand, we're seeing a falling functional literacy rate in recent years. Now, firstly, a very important disclaimer. Functional literacy is much harder to measure accurately, because, as we discussed before, even defining functional literacy can be difficult. Ask 10 different English teachers what they define as functional literacy, and even though all of them could identify if a person was functionally literate or not based on how they write or follow written instructions, they may not share a common definition. Also, there are other factors such as literacy being measured only for one language, so children who've immigrated from other countries and still learning English, while being completely literate in their first language, might be unfairly marked as illiterate. Nonetheless, there are some disturbing statistics, such as the proportion of children not reaching the minimum reading benchmark increasing from 14 to 19% in the past decade. That's right, in the last 10 years, fewer children proportionally can read at an effective level. In more recent studies, it was shown that only 60% of 15-year-olds achieved the most basic level of reading, whereas the other 40% struggled to read or write. These are children who, in 1 to 3 years, will either be going into university or joining the workforce. It gets even worse for writing. 63% of Year 4 students, roughly 9 years old, were achieving at or above curriculum for writing, and a meager 35% achieved this in Year 8. There have been similar trends noted in other developed English-speaking countries. In the UK, 9 million people of working age have low literacy and numeracy skills, while 1 in 5 young university students struggled with anything more advanced than basic tasks, such as reading instructions on an aspirin bottle. And these are university students. The US are doing even worse, where only 79% of their adults are literate as of 2024, well below the world average, while 54% of adults have functional literacy skills below 6th grade level. And then there's the thorny issue of COVID, considered the greatest disruption to education in history. Many of the statistics I mentioned were from pre-COVID years, so you can imagine that the issues are only getting worse. Ask any school teacher around you, and I can bet that every single one of them can tell you that they're very, very concerned that the children are not thriving when it comes to learning. Things are going backwards. The smart ones are doing fine, as they always have, but it's the bulk of the bell curve and the tail end who are really suffering. I tried looking up some more concrete stats, but the negative effects of COVID on education probably won't show up for another 5 to 10 years. So all I can tell you is that anecdotally, we are definitely noticing that functional literacy rates are falling. The worst part seems to be, people seem to be caring less and less about literacy as a whole. There are high school students who can't read and follow basic instructions, saying things like, "Oh, I don't need to do English, I'm going to be an engineer." Not knowing how you need literacy to, write reports, read manuals, make a presentation, apply for jobs, do your taxes. The list really goes on. And it's hard to convince children how important it is to read books to improve their literacy when they don't see adults reading. There's a beautiful and depressing word that I learned while researching the topic of literacy, and that is illiteracy. Basically, this is when someone knows how to read, as in they're literate, but they choose not to. That's right, I'm looking at all you people who haven't read a single book in the past year. In 2002, which depressingly is 22 frickin' years ago, it was observed that 46.7% of adult Americans didn't read a book not required for work or school in that whole year. And I suspect that number has only risen since then. Which is frightening. Here we have a literal superpower that lets us achieve so much, and half the people aren't even using it or know how to use it well. What's more scary is that the concept of increasing illiteracy and illiteracy, as in people either not being able to read or write or choosing not to, has been warned by science fiction writers for over a century. Just look at some of the most famous dystopian novels: Brave New World, 1984, Fahrenheit 451, and The Handmaid's Tale. In many or most of these dystopias, where society lives miserably under an oppressive totalitarian regime, people are choosing not to or banned from reading. In the case of Fahrenheit 451, firemen aren't putting out fires, they're lighting books on fire to prevent people from reading up and becoming more educated. In 1984, the government is even trying to dumb down language with newspeak so that people can't even think about revolution or questioning the state. And if George Orwell or Ray Bradbury were alive now to see what's happening with literacy, they'd be giving us the most exasperate, "I told you so," because their cautionary fictions are becoming realities. Bookshops are closing, political divides are deepening, fear and anxiety is driving regressive policies such as the revocation of women's reproductive rights, and corporations have increasing control over our opinions and preferences through aggressive marketing and manipulation of the social media algorithm. So, why is this happening? Why is it that despite so much great progress made in literacy rates over the last 300 years, we're starting to see it fall? Well, there's the obvious elephant in the room, and that is technology. As much as technology has helped us learn and develop literacy, such as cheap and widely available books thanks to paper and the printing press, light sources that let us read even in the darkest hours of night, and free educational material throughout the internet, we can't ignore the myriad of alternative uses of our time that technology has provided us. You know that experiment where rats, if given a way to trigger the pleasure centers of their brain with the press of a button, would press it thousands of times a day, foregoing sleep, eating, and mating? Well, we've discovered that button for us, and that's the content algorithm. Whether it be social media feeds such as Facebook, or the platform formerly known as Twitter, entertaining shows that keep on giving such as Netflix or YouTube, or highly addictive and stimulating short-form media such as TikTok and Instagram Reels, we have countless ways to keep our brain jacked up with dopamine so that we're never bored, whether it's on public transport, in bed, or even sitting on the toilet. All of these new, hot multimedia platforms are precisely designed to steal your attention and keep it for as long as possible. Because nowadays, your eyeballs are the most expensive organs, because attention equals profit for companies. So, of course, they're incredibly addictive, hijacking your brain's natural reward system to keep you glued to the screen for as much as possible every day. This means that A, you have less time to pick up a book and read it, but more importantly, B, you get used to having entertainment and information fed to you in bite-sized chunks, meaning your attention span gets shorter and shorter. And I'm privileged because you, dear listener, have chosen to listen to me explaining difficult concepts in dulcet tones for 3/4 of an hour every month. So you probably have some capacity to focus on something for longer than a 1-minute video. But many people around the world are rapidly losing that ability. Many children nowadays don't even want to watch a film because it feels too long. Hell, I have very intelligent, high-achieving friends who refuse to watch any educational content on YouTube longer than 10 minutes because they'd rather watch something shorter and punchier. So yeah, books have really strong competition for your attention, and sadly, they're losing. I myself have noticed that in the last 10 to 15 years that my attention span and focus have shortened due to the algorithms. So I'm actively trying to cut down on social media and short-form entertainment and instead focusing on creative hobbies like this podcast and writing books. Ask yourself, when's the last time you spent actively focusing on or thinking about something for over 30 minutes? And no, TV shows don't count because that's pretty passive. There are probably several other factors that compound the issue, but in general, shorter attention spans, addictive multimedia, and widespread exposure to the internet from a young age all contribute to the deteriorating literacy rates that we're seeing. There's a lot of debate about whether you could argue that this is just the natural transition for humanity as technology develops, that knowing how to use the internet and using audiovisual media to access information is just another type of literacy, or that the youths don't understand written text from previous generations because they approach information and text in different ways, such as the use of slang and neologism to distinguish themselves from the old. But at the same time, we are seeing both youths and adults becoming more susceptible to false information, becoming swayed by charming snake oil peddlers telling us to follow their cause, and having poorer ability to write coherent sentences or understand deeper literature. There's also an interesting argument that we're seeing our societies transition from a written language culture back to an oral tradition culture. As people rely more and more on videos and podcasts and word of mouth for how they obtain information and interface with society, we're seemingly becoming less reliant on written text and more on spoken word. Which may just be natural technological progression or cultural evolution, but what if we see our society feel the impacts of oral tradition on our thinking? We mentioned Walter J. Ong's research that cultures of oral tradition tend to show less ability for complex and abstract thinking. What if we're seeing people become less logical, less critical in their thinking, and generally simpler? There's no easy answer to any of these questions. How do you improve functional literacy in children? How do we improve our attention spans? How can we continue to approach problems with critical thinking and think and feel for ourselves? But if there's one thing for sure, is that I can guarantee you that things always get better with a good book in your hand. So go on, pick up a book, whether it's a paperback, a Kobo or a Kindle, an audiobook, or even a graphic novel, and rediscover the joy of reading. And if you need book recommendations, flick me an email or reach out on that accursed social media, and I can send you some book recommendations that I've enjoyed recently. So, what did we learn today? We learned about the history of writing, and how reading was a privilege enjoyed mostly by the ruling class in ancient times. We learned about the difference between traditional and functional literacy. We learned that there are many different types of functional literacy, from numeracy to financial literacy to media literacy to health literacy. We learned just how important literacy is, from improving your socioeconomic status, your health, your ability to think and feel for yourself, and most importantly, to your empowerment. We learned how illiteracy and alliteracy are steadily rising thanks to technologies such as social media and short-form video content, and how this could have serious negative impacts as cautioned by authors such as Ray Bradbury and George Orwell. Lastly, we learned that books are awesome, and you should definitely find ways to read more. Alright, for today's 2-Minute Explain, let's talk about a weird quirk of the English language. Meese. That's right, if the plural of goose is geese, then the plural of moose should be meese, right? But you'd be wrong. The plural of moose is just moose. I know, frustrating, right? Just like how the plural of house is not heis like mice, how you have many sheep, not sheeps, and how fish refer to the plural of a singular type of fish like 7 salmon, whereas fishes suggest multiple types of fishes like salmon and tuna. And don't even get me started on octopuses versus octopi versus octopodes. The reason for this infuriating inconsistency in grammar is that English is a real mess of a language, because it amalgamates so many different root languages. Goose is an old word that derives from Old English, which comes from Germanic roots. In Old English, words were turned into plural through something called mutation, where the vowel sounds are changed to another vowel sound, like oo to e. So, goose, geese, foot, feet, tooth, teeth. But moose comes from Native American, specifically Northeastern Algonquian. So, it doesn't follow the Old English rules because it's its own language. And yes, those are two different its, one with an apostrophe, one with another. Learn the difference. You see examples like this all throughout English, especially when it comes to pronunciation. This is why O-U-G-H can be pronounced as rough, plow, through, though, thought, thorough, cough, hiccup, and lock. Yay. Depending on where the word is from, whether it's Latin, Germanic, French, or even some non-Romantic languages such as Arabic or African or Asian roots, the words follow their own grammar rules. Which is why the rule I before E except after C has more exceptions than words that actually fit the rule. Yeah, English sucks. But at the same time, learning about varied etymology and weird English rules such as facts like about red duplication, where you have to say I sounds before A sounds before O sounds, such as tic-tac-toe, jibber-jabber, and hip-hop, or that adjectives always have to be read in a specific order, such as Little Red Riding Hood and My Big Fat Greek Wedding, are part of why I love learning more about the broken language that it is. And for more weird language knowledge, you can subscribe and follow this podcast. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Explain This. I hope you've learned something interesting and maybe even useful today. Send us an email or leave us a comment saying what book you've enjoyed reading recently, because I love book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Bye for now. Explain This was written and hosted by me, Jin Kim. If you'd like to suggest a topic or just send a lovely message, you can email me at explainthiscast@gmail.com or follow me on Facebook or Twitter